The Book of Esther, mystery or miracle? The Book of Esther is one of the most celebrated books of the Old Testament because of its connection with the Jewish festival known today as Purim. The setting is the Achaemenid Empire during the 5th century, about 80 years since King Cyrus the Great defeated Babylon and allowed the Jews to return to Judea. Some Jews are settled in Susa and the Persian provinces surrounding areas during this time. King Xerxes comes into power and sets the stage for our story. The central theme of the book is deliverance of the Jewish people from being utterly destroyed by a man named Haman who arose from the Persian court and was fueled with hatred, with his utmost desire being to destroy the Jewish people. Because of their deliverance and because of the miraculous story within the narrative, this book has been elevated to a status of inspiration, popularity, and encouragement to this day. Despite its popularity, however, there are some interesting questions around the book that have puzzled scholars for centuries. For example, did you know that Esther was one of the last books to be accepted within the Hebrew canon? And it wasn't without much debate either from both Jewish and Christian circles. And Purim, what does this word mean anyway? When we look closely at it, it's certainly not of Hebrew origin, so what can be understood from the meaning and the origins of this word? And who exactly is this Haman guy? And why did he hate the Jews so much? And what really happened to him towards the end of the narrative? What's up, everyone? This is AJ from Ancient Bible World, and I'm excited to dig into some of these questions with you. Thank you for tuning in, and if you find this video interesting or informative at all, please don't hesitate to hit that like, subscribe, and share button. Now let's dig in. While Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, describes 22 books in the Hebrew canon, because he doesn't enumerate them, it's difficult to know exactly when this book was officially canonized. There's not really much evidence that the Book of Esther was canonized by the Academy of Yavne at the Council of Yamnia in 90 CE, towards the end of the 1st century, when the rabbis of the 2nd century CE justified Purim as a day of eating and rejoicing. They cited as their authority Megillat Ta'anit, a fasting scroll from the Mishnah dating to the 1st century CE, but not the Book of Esther itself. Because of this, some scholars would date the Book of Esther's canonization to the Academy of Susa in 140 CE, soon after the Bar Kokhba revolt, but some even later to around 200 CE. What makes things even more interesting is, in rabbinic literature dating as late as the 3rd and 4th century CE, there's still some noted apprehension towards the book. For example, when we look at the Babylonian Talmud, Megillah 7a, it says, Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel, Esther Eina Metam'a et Hayadayim. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, the Book of Esther does not render the hands ritually impure. Now, this might seem strange to modern readers. What does it mean that the Book of Esther does not render the hands ritually impure, and how does it affect its canonical status? You see, in the world of rabbinic thought, if something has a high level of sanctity or a high level of sacredness, then it has the ability to render one's hands unclean once you touch it. All the scriptures had the ability to render one's hands ritually impure. You might ask, what's the purpose of that? When you read more throughout the Mishnah, you'll see that some of the most holy and important things, such as terumah, which was food offerings, and megillot, which were biblical scrolls, and these were some of the most holy and sacred regarded items. According to the Mishnah, there was an issue with storing terumah, food offerings, and megillot, scrolls, in the same place. Mishnaic commentators record that rodents would come in and destroy the food offerings, and along with the food offerings, the parchment scrolls as well. And if you think about it, the parchment scrolls, which are made from animal flesh themselves, would attract mammals that are scavenging and looking for food. And so the rabbis came up with the halakhic law that touching these items renders one's hands ritually unclean. This was to establish a sacred barrier that increased the level of reverence that one has to show to each of these items. Anytime you touch a holy and sacred item, and before you go and touch another holy and sacred item, you have to wash your hand. Not only that, but it affected the way that these items were stored as well. Each sacred and holy item deserved its own private storage space, so that there's no cross-contamination from unwanted guests. things like this. So while it might seem backwards in our minds, in rabbinic thought, the notion that a scroll renders someone's hands ritually impure actually elevates its status of sanctity. So with that understanding, we see here that the Book of Esther, in the opinion of some of the sages, did not render the hands ritually impure, meaning it was not on the same level of sacredness of the other biblical scrolls. Let's continue to tractate Sanhedrin 104. Revi bar Shmuel verab Huna bar Hiya havo ka matakni mitechot sifrei dibei Rab Yehuda ki matu Megillat Esther amri ha Megillat Esther lo ba'i mitpachat amar lehu ki hai gvona name nichze ki afkeruta. Levi bar Shmuel and Rav Huna bar Hiya were mending the coverings of the sacred scrolls in Rav Yehuda's academy. When they came to the scroll of Esther, they said, "This scroll, that is the scroll of Esther, does not need a mantle." He said to them, that is Rav Yehuda, even speaking like that appears to be irreverent. So even if the book was included in the earlier Hebrew canons that we discussed earlier, and there were certainly rabbis that did elevate the status of Esther as inspirational, it is clear that there was still some skepticism of it all the way up to the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. Now let's move on to the issue of canon in Christian circles. In the Western churches, Esther was nearly always regarded as canonical, while in the Eastern churches it was a very different story, especially in the areas of Anatolia and Syria. It was denied canonical status by several bishops, but despite the hesitation from some popular bishops, the book was ultimately accepted as canonical by both the Laodicean and Apostolic canons. Thus, Amphilochius, the bishop of Iconium, said it best when he observed that Esther was only accepted by some. While eventually the debate over Esther died down in the patristic period, it arose again during the Reformation. The Book of Esther also has 2 Greek editions, totaling in 107 verses not found in the Hebrew text, and these became debated and controversial among the 16th century reformers. Following the lead of Martin Luther, Protestants labeled the editions in Greek as apocryphal, and the Masoretic text became their sacred edition, while the Roman Catholic Church continued its long-standing tradition in acceptance of these editions. Yet despite the acceptance within the Protestant Reformation of the Hebrew Masoretic version of Esther, there was still hostility by one of the most famous Protestant reformers of all. Martin Luther said, "I am so hostile to this book, 2nd Maccabees and Esther, that I could wish that they did not exist at all, for they Judaize too greatly and have much pagan impropriety." What were they also hesitant about? Well, for starters, there are multiple versions of the Esther narrative. We have the traditional Masoretic text version and 2 versions within the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible dating to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. Scholars refer to the 2 Greek versions as the Old Greek version and the Alpha Text version. Both tell the narrative slightly differently, adding varying style and even additional scenes and chapters. Additionally, the book seems to have threads of Mesopotamian flavor found throughout. For example, there are theophoric names such as Mordecai, which many scholars have equated to the theophoric name Marduka for the deity Marduk in Mesopotamia. Esther also could potentially represent the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar. Questions around cultural influence in the Purim festival and its origins. So many rabbis and sages, and even some of the church fathers, were skeptical of this festival and this book altogether. In the Masoretic text, there is no mention of basic Old Testament themes and institutions such as the law, dietary regulations, covenant election, open prayer, the temple, Jerusalem, and sacrifice and offering. Its most conspicuous absence, however, is any reference to God. The Lord God of Israel is not mentioned by name or title once. Some have even speculated that perhaps this could be why the Book of Esther is the only biblical book not found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran. Now, it could just be that we haven't found Esther at Qumran because we simply haven't found it. It doesn't necessarily have to imply that the sect at Qumran used it or didn't use it, but one does find it interesting. If we have fragments of every single biblical book, why not the Book of Esther? So why was the Masoretic text chosen for canonization for the Jews and for Protestants? Well, first off, the Hebrew Masoretic text was considered more sacred because of its preservation of the original biblical language, Hebrew. While the Greek Septuagint versions are translations from Hebrew, they're still not written in Hebrew. But whether they realized it or not, the rabbis and the early church fathers also had logic on their side. You see, because it lacks explicit theology and overt divine language, it is certainly the more difficult reading. And even today, within the field of modern day textual criticism, there's a principle of lectio difficilior potior, which simply means in Latin, the difficult reading is preferred. This is because, logically speaking, if a scribe comes across the writing that is difficult in theology or difficult in narrative, then he would naturally be tempted to revise or correct. Therefore, the Greek expansions with the extra material probably represent attempts to clarify and theologize the narrative. The features that I mentioned missing from the Masoretic text, such as open prayer, the mentioning of God, are explicitly mentioned in both Greek versions. For these reasons, some scholars, myself included, will argue that the Masoretic text is the more original. What about the Persian cultural texture? Does it weaken the book? Actually, it's the opposite. It helps situate the book historically within the world of diaspora, within the Achaemenid court. In other words, we can say the book is not mythological borrowing. It is Jewish storytelling in an imperial environment. The silence of certain Judean theological elements to include the divine name is not mistaken absence. It is narrative strategy. It fits perfect for a diaspora context where there is no temple, no prophet, no overt miracle. Esther, thus, is the perfect narrative illustration that portrays a God so very close in sovereignty, despite his people being so physically far away from home. The thread of human initiative, along with divine providence, is the heart of this narrative. So, while the odds may have been stacked against it, the Book of Esther survived canon controversy, which is something quite amazing because it is literally the perfect style for the Book of Diaspora. Truly a miracle. Now let's move on to the origins of this word, Purim. Where did this word come from? The word Purim is only found in the Book of Esther and is understood by lexicons to be a Persian loanword. The word refers to lot, as in casting lots in a situation where chance is the resolve, or fate, if you will. In Hebrew, the equivalent to this word pur is goral, and we even have it used alongside the word pur in Esther 3:7. Let's take a look. בחודש הראשון הוא חודש ניסן, בשנת 12 למלך אחשוורוש, הפיל פור הוא הגורל לפני המן, מיום ליום ומחודש לחודש, 12 הוא חודש אדר. In the first month, that is, the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, he cast the pur, that is, the lot, before Haman, from day to day, and from month to month, to the 12th month, that is, the month of Adar. You see, here we have both words. This word pur, meaning lot, with a more Persian origin, or so we think, alongside the more common Hebrew word used in classic biblical Hebrew, goral. So let's read a couple more places where we have this word pur. Ki Haman ben Hamdata ha'agagi tzoral kol ha'yehudim chashav al ha'yehudim le'abdam vehipil pur hu ha'goral lehumam ule'abdam. For Haman, the son of Hamdata, the Agagite, enemy of all the Jews, conspired against the Jews to destroy them, and he cast lot, that is, the lot, to scatter them and to destroy them. Again, here we have pur and hagoral side by side, and this is the instance where Haman had decided to annihilate the Jews because of his offense with Mordecai not bowing down to him after being promoted, and he left the date up to this chance, up to this pur, or this goral. But again, what are the origins of this word pur? Let's take one more look at another verse. Al ken kar'u layamim ha'ele purim, al shem ha'pur, al ken al kol divrei ha'igeret hazot, u'ma ra'u al kacha, u'ma hagiya alehem. Therefore, they call these days Purim, because of the name of the lot, and because of all the words of this letter, and what they had seen, and because of all the things that had befell upon them. Here we have the plural form of the word pur, Purim, specifically telling us that this is where they derive the name of this festival after the lot that was cast to destroy them. Yet when we take a deeper look at this word pur and its supposed Persian origins, we find that even before the Achaemenid Empire, This word Pur has origins in Akkadian. In Mesopotamian inscriptions, everywhere it's recorded, and this is where things start to get interesting. These are the rows of steles, or in German known as Stellenreichen. They're very important Neo-Assyrian archaeological discoveries. Found at Ashur by Walter Andre in the 20th century, they consist of two long parallel rows of stone stelae set up in an open area near the temple complex of the national god Ashur. They were erected over several centuries, primarily during the Middle and Neo-Assyrian period, and they have to do with calendrical matters such as the naming of years. Ancient Assyria used an eponym system, in Akkadian, limu, and this is a system where they named their years after highly ranked officials. First, of course, the king. He would take his limu year, and after the king typically would follow his highly ranked officials. And this was done, theoretically anyway, by the casting of Pur. This is in fact where our word Pur comes from. Puru in ancient Akkadian also means lot, and we have this throughout these calendrical inscriptions everywhere. And not only in calendrical inscriptions, but in other inscriptions also that we'll look at. The Puru was cast potentially during New Year festivals. Each year, as I said, was named after a high-ranking official. Some of these officials had different titles, such as Tortanu, commander-in-chief, right under the king, Ravshake, chief cupbearer, should sound familiar to you from the Book of Kings, Ravshakeh during the time of Hezekiah and his revolt against Sanherib, Nagir Elaki, palace herald, and Masenu, the chamberlain. So as I said, the kings would take their limu, not always, but typically first, and after the king would come these governing officials. Now to be clear, scholars are not quite sure about exactly how often, if ever, this practice was really left to chance. Several Assyriologists have noted that records reflect certain kings using a variety of ordering their limu years for themselves and their officials. But still, this is a fascinating context and a really good hint and window of the early origins of this word Pur, or Purim, all the way back into the Neo-Assyrian period. Another instance where we have a really good example of how this was used is in the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, dating to the Neo-Assyrian Empire, 827 to 824 BCE, found in Nimrud, modern-day Iraq, by Austin Layard in the middle of the 19th century. The obelisk is most famously known for its depiction of King Jehu, the Israelite king, submitting and paying tribute to King Shalmaneser III. This gives us an example where a king was able to claim 2 limu years for himself after a long reign of 30 years. In my 31st year, I cast the Puru for the second time before the gods Ashur and Adad, and at the same time, his ministers cast lots to determine the order in which they would serve to name the years remaining to the long-lived king. So through the Shalmaneser inscription, we get a glimpse of how this process potentially would have worked. This would have been a very important, very sacred process that was probably done by priests or high-ranking officials themselves, or even the kings. And again, it is debated whether or not this matter was truly left up to chance, or whether or not the king designated his officials to lead and then allowed them to go through the casting Puru process just as a ritual. Next, we have another fascinating discovery, which is referred to as the Lot of Yachalu, found in ancient Mesopotamia. The Lot of Yachalu dates to the 9th century BC, and it is a true 6-sided die cube. And Assyriologists think that the method used was potentially placing it in a long-necked bottle or jug and shaken, or thrown on the floor, or possibly rolled in a bowl. Inscribed on the cube is named Yachalu, who was likely a very powerful official. He is attested with 3 different eponym years as Masenu or Tartanu, O Ashur, the great lord, O Adad, the great lord, the Lot of Yachalu, the grand vizier of Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, governor of the land for the city of Kibshuni, in the land of Kumeni, the land of Michrani, Uku, and the Cedar Mountain, and minister of trade in his year assigned to him by Puru. May the harvest of the land of Assyria prosper and thrive in front of the gods Ashur and Adad, and may his Puru fall. While the Yachalu die is unique in its inscription, giving us an example of an amazing connection between the imperial calendar in theory and potentially in practice, it is certainly not unique in the sense that many societies use such items for games, divination, or designating items such as inheritance. Here we have a variety of lots dating all the way back to even the 3rd millennium. Quite fascinating, isn't it? reminds you of a game of dice. So this likely represents a broader linguistic cultural background behind the word Pur in Esther, all the way from ancient Assyria through Persia and into our Hebrew Bibles, all while not losing its meaning and to some extent its context. Wow, what a hidden treasure. And one last thing I'll note, in the ancient world, casting lots determined the years, offices, and destinies. In Esther, what's interesting is a lot is cast to determine the destruction of the Jews. But the story shows that even the lot falls under divine sovereignty. And again, while God's name may not be mentioned explicitly within the text, certainly in the way the events unfold and the way the ultimate lots are cast, he is present in every way. Lastly, who is Haman? Why did he hate the Jews so much? And what happened to him in the end of the narrative? Let's look at another passage in Esther, chapter 3, verse 10. Vayisar hamelech et tabato me'al yado vayitna lehaman ben Hamdata ha'agagi tzorer ha'yehudim. And the king removed his ring from his hand, and he gave it to Haman, the son of Hamdata, the Agagite, enemy of the Jews. The name Agagite is significant to us. In 1 Samuel 15, 8 through 33, the name Agag appears as the name of an Amalekite king. Do you think there's a connection there? Well, the sages in rabbinic literature certainly thought so. Let's take a look at the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Megillah 13a. Dela Katleya David, Lishmi, Deit Yeli Mineya, Mordecai, Demikanne, Biya Haman, Umashilem Le Yemini, Dela Katleya, Shaul le'agag, Deit Yelid Mineya Haman, Demsa'a le'Israel. Now just a quick note about Rabbinic Aramaic. It's quite fascinating how much it's similar but also very different from Hebrew syntax and grammar. Now just look at the first phrase, Dela Katleya David, that David did not kill. Here we have the sentence beginning with a negative particle, Dela, and that dalet there is actually a relative particle, which means that, or which. It's the equivalent to the biblical Hebrew asher, or in modern Hebrew, she. And la, it's simply the negative particle no. The biblical Hebrew equivalent would be lo, still used in Hebrew today. And what's fascinating is la is still the negative particle used in Arabic. Now this verb, katleya, kill. This verb is fascinating because of the object suffix hey at the end of it. Now this may seem like a feminine verb, but it's not. That hey at the end is the object suffix, referring to leshmi, because he did not kill him, the him, which is shemi. In Aramaic, the marker for the object suffix of the third masculine singular is, instead of a vav, it's a hey. Isn't that fascinating? Nevertheless, this is not an Aramaic or Hebrew instructional video, so I'll move on. I just think it's neat. That David did not kill Shimei, from whom was descended Mordecai, who provoked Haman. And now a Benjamite repaid me. That Saul did not slay Agag, from whom was descended Haman, who oppressed Israel. So, by using Agagi, is the author of Esther connecting Haman with the age-old Israelite enemy, the Amalekites? The sages certainly thought so. This would certainly add some serious spiritual depth to the story of Esther, Mordecai, and Haman, where Esther and Mordecai are not just dealing with a man that hates the Jews, but in rabbinic thought, they are acting as the completers of the unfinished business of Saul, 1 Samuel 15, and the memorial of the Lord who swore to blot out the memory of Amalek in Exodus 17, 8 through 16, and Deuteronomy 25, 17 through 19. Now it's important to be clear. The text of Esther never explicitly says Amalek. It simply says the Agagites. But for anyone who knew Israel's history, the name carries centuries of memory, which is why the rabbis interpret it this way. So how did Haman die? Well, the text says that Haman was hung on the very gallows that was meant for Mordecai. And later on we read that his 10 sons joined him in this fate in chapter 9, verse 13. But the text is quite interesting when we look at it closely. Let's have a look at Esther 7, verse 10. Vayitlu et Haman al ha'etz asher hechin leMordecai v'chamat hamelech shachacha. And they hung Haman upon the tree which was prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath was settled. When we read the text plainly, they hung Haman on a tree. Well, the Hebrew Bible does mention hanging men on trees, as early as the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 21, verses 22 through 23, for example, as punishment for sin that is worthy of death. And the Bible actually commands not to leave these men there because they become a curse. The question I and other Near Eastern scholars have asked is there any practice within the world of ancient Persia or ancient Assyria for that matter? And as we have it, there are Persian inscriptions that describe the punishment of impalement, where criminals were made an example of by impaling them on a large stake and leaving them out on public display for all to see as a warning. So when we look at the death of Haman in the ancient Near Eastern context, this was a known practice for the Persian Empire. However, just to give you guys a unique visual, I'm going to show you some examples from the Neo-Assyrian period. Check out this wall relief of King Tiglath-Pileser III. He was a king from Neo-Assyria from 945 to 927 BC, and this relief was found in the central palace at Nimrud, modern-day Iraq, by Austin Layard. It's depicting an invasion of an unknown town with enemy soldiers impaled on large wooden stakes to ward off others from attacking. Additionally, we have the wall relief of King Sennacherib, the infamous invasion of Lachish, also recorded in 2 Kings 18 through 21, found in Nineveh, the Southwest Palace, by Austin Henry Layard, with a similar depiction. So in the ancient Near East, especially in Assyria and later Persia, execution by impalement or exposure on a wooden stake was a well-attested imperial punishment that was set up intentionally out in the public square to make an example of a grave offense or to ward off enemies from trying to attack a recently invaded village or city. Now, going back to Deuteronomy, the language regarding hanging people on trees specifically says that the one hanged on a tree becomes a curse. This is why it was forbidden in ancient Israel to leave a man hanging upon a tree. And ironically, when we think about the climax of the story and Haman being hung on the tree, the one who sought to curse Israel was placed on the tree and became a curse himself for all the province to see. Isn't that powerful? As we conclude, I hope that you've seen the Book of Esther is both a beautiful mystery and an incredible miracle, displaying powerful virtues as the faithfulness of God, the uniqueness of the time, and God's ability and His faithfulness to show up and be very near and present to a people that may appear to be very physically far away from Him. What a powerful message. And so remember, no matter what situation you're in today, no matter what you're going through in your personal life or how far you may feel away from God, the very same God that was very real and sovereignly present for His people hundreds of miles away from their homeland is the very same God that is very present and near to you. I'm AJ from Ancient Bible World, and until next time, take care.